London's population in the Victorian period experienced a huge population increase, going from around 1 million people to over 5 million people at the end of the century. This of course brought many problems with it, like the development of slums and the likes. But there's one that's never really shown in the movies, and that's the fact that the city streets were just caked in manure. There were thousands of horses filling the streets and depositing their load at a faster rate than it could be cleaned up. This caused a great panic as many people began to speculate that cities would be uninhabitable in just a few years. For instance, the Times said, "In 50 years every street in London will be buried under 9 feet of manure." This was the Great Manure Crisis of 1894. Now, of course, the invention of the car completely made this problem redundant, but in modern times we can be thankful for so many inventions, like reading glasses, and better yet, attractive reading glasses. In the past you would have been saddled with some pretty atrocious designs, but today they've got even better thanks to my sponsor, Warby Parker. They are committed to providing exceptional vision care online and in stores, offering eyeglasses, sunglasses, eye exams and even contact lenses. Glasses from them start from just $95, which includes prescription lenses, and you also have the possibility to try them for free at home. So you can order 5 pairs of glasses from them for free and try them on. You're given 5 days to do so, so maybe try a pair each day, see how they feel and see how people respond. They ship them out for free and there's even a prepaid return shipping label included. Then you can pick out whichever one you preferred and buy that one, or you can send them all back if none appeal to you, as there's no obligation to buy. So go to warbyparker.com/jabzy and pick 5 pairs of glasses to get sent to your home, try them on, get some second opinions, and look very dapper this Christmas and New Year. So in 1893, W.J. Gordon wrote The Horse World of London, detailing the number of horses in the city and their various roles. He estimated that there were 9,000 cabs in London. 2/3 of these cabs required 2 horses to pull them, meaning there were 15,000 horses in the city just for cabs alone. But even he couldn't find the true number for the total number of horses on the streets, but it's widely believed to be somewhere in the ballpark of 300,000. These would be bringing goods into the city, carrying things around ports and the likes, and even pulling horse trams and buses. These were developed in the Victorian period as a way for poor people to get around the city, and they would require up to 12 horses each. Wagonettes needed a couple horses and were used to take Londoners out on holiday into the countryside, and richer people would often have their own horse for transport. In fact, it's believed 25,000 of these privately owned horses would travel around London on any given day. Plus, on market days, thousands of horses would arrive from the outskirts of London, bringing produce into places like Smithfields. And to complicate matters, a lot of live animals were also herded into the city as well. But before we get onto the manure, just think for a moment about the logistics behind housing and feeding 300,000 horses. Obviously they all weren't kept in stables surrounded by fields. This would have been radically impractical. So inside the city, there were hundreds of buildings just for horses. Inside wealthier areas they had mews, which were narrow alleyways designed for stables. If you check a map of the richer areas of London in the west, you can still find these today, like Colville Mews in Notting Hill or Warren Mews in Fitzrovia. Now today they've largely all been converted into residential housing, as they were always 2-story buildings. On the ground floor the horses lived in pretty plush stables, while the upstairs housed the people who worked with them. The rich people on the other hand would live in a nearby street, but this couldn't be emulated across London. So businesses often had their own stables nearby, and so too did railway stations. Paddington Station in fact developed their own version of a multi-storey car park, known as the Mint Stable, which was 3 stories high. Some horses, like over in Southwark, even had a pretty impressive view of St. Paul's, and multi-storey stables can still be found in places like Hong Kong, where land is in short supply. Then there were coaching inns, which were incredibly important to travel and trade in centuries gone by, as it was a place for travellers to sleep and eat, plus they had places for their horses to rest. Or, if you were on a particularly important journey, they could even swap your tired horse out for a fresh one. One of the most impressive that is still with us is the George Inn in Southwark, which has a gallery, and from here people would watch plays in Elizabethan times. Plus it is also mentioned in a couple of Dickens stories as well. Yet the most famous was probably the Tabard, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. This was also in Southwark, and was the starting off point for the Canterbury Tales. Other smaller pubs would also have a place for horses usually next door, like the Cross Keys on Endell Street. But the Cross Keys also seems to have housed a camel at one point in Victorian times. And in fact, you could find a number of strange animals on London streets, including zebras. But anyway, these stables would just be small, usually only containing one horse or two, but they would be needed to bring the beer and everything else into the pub, so the horses would be very essential. But you can still see evidence of them by looking at the names of institutions around various pubs. For instance, next door to the Cross Keys, there is a gay massage parlour which for many years was called the Stables. Or you could store your horse at a livery and bait stables, which would obviously charge people to look after their horses. But many of these also doubled up as a pub, like the Black Bull in Camden. Then, keeping to Camden, horses could also be housed underground, in particularly built up areas. So the Camden market obviously required a number of horses for goods to be brought in, so they created the Camden Catacombs, a huge underground complex. Here many horses would sleep, but now if you go to Camden, you can also see the Stables Market, which you can probably guess housed a great number of horses. This used to belong to Pickfords Haulage company, which still operates today, and has been in existence since the 17th century. They owned more than 4,000 horses across London, and had a small team of vets as well. So there was haulage companies, pubs, railway stations, and a lot of people needed horses. And of course so too did the police. The London police actually still have a couple of stables in places like Hyde Park. But besides housing the horses, you also had to dispose of the dead ones. 400 a week would actually die on the street of exhaustion, but the number of dead would be far larger if you included the ill ones who were taken to one of the couple dozen knackers yards in London. These knackers yards would deal with the dead horses and process their meat. One thing they could produce was cat's meat, and this, by the way, is meat for cats rather than people selling cat meat. These cat meat sellers would push their carts around London selling their wares, and going off pictures, they would be followed by cats the entire way. But there were all sorts of things that the knackers yards could make out of dead horses, like obviously glue. But then horse hair was used for mattresses, skins for leather, bones for manure, and fat was used for grease. Then, although technically only used for cat meat, there are stories of it being sold to humans as well. Also, even when a horse was on the brink of dying, they could be rented out to a hackney cab for a couple of weeks. As for the owners of these yards, some like John Atchiller became incredibly wealthy, and by the time of his death in 1867, he would have had over £3 million in today's money. But the actions of the workers in these yards partially inspired the creation of the SPCA, which was founded way back in 1824. It was mentioned in the novel Louisa Seymour, as the main characters discussed this organisation when seeing the state of horses pulling cabs. So obviously the ones being rented out just before the point of death. Through the works of these early advocates of animal rights, many people were prosecuted for abusing animals. However, more were prosecuted for the smell they produced, as they often left the horses to starve, then rot in their own filth. So the respectable people of London obviously complained about this. But really, the stench of London all round was pretty unbearable. As Henry Mayhew wrote, strangers coming from the country frequently described the streets of London as smelling of dung like a stable yard. So finally, this brings me to the manure. Initially it was the job of crossing sweepers to clean up the muck, while asking for tips. There was a small army of them who were mainly young boys, out on the streets at the beginning of the 19th century. But they would mainly do business in the richer ends of London, leaving the poor East End and elsewhere dirty. This obviously presented a problem in the poorer areas, and the filth accumulating in the poor areas was often blamed on the poor and their lack of moral backbone. These sentiments were even echoed in government reports. So the poorer areas were getting dirtier and disease was spreading, plus along with manure, remember there would be a lot of urine coming from horses as well. For instance, in the middle of the 19th century, Londoners tried a couple times to put wooden footpaths on some pedestrian streets, but the amount of urine made this impossible. It is estimated that 57,000 litres of urine hit the streets of London each day, alongside 570 kilos of manure. This was far more than anybody could feasibly clean, so the manure kept on building up, especially in the 1890s. This is when the Times predicted that within 50 years or so, the city would be buried in 9 feet of the stuff. Before this, manure used to have an economic benefit, as it was cleaned and sent out to farms as fertiliser, but now it was an issue. And not just a London issue, it was a problem across the world in cities like Paris and New York, and in the United States, Access magazine estimated that 3 billion flies were hatching daily from horse manure in their country, thus helping the spread of disease. Other papers meanwhile were predicting that it would reach the 3rd floor of buildings in New York by 1930. Then, just keeping on New York, that city was disposing of 15,000 dead horses a year, and vacant lots were filling up with manure dumps, sometimes up to 50 feet high. So in 1898, there was an international urban planning conference. There, for 10 days, people from across the world hoped to find a solution to the problem, but to no avail. They left without any solutions at all. It seemed that the cities were doomed and urban life was on its way out. But fortunately, for everyone really, they were saved by a series of inventions that popped up all at the same time. The electric trolley bus helped people move from horses for their daily commutes, and then, more importantly, the car was invented. Most people switched to it for obvious reasons, not for sanitary reasons, but it still saved the cities from being submerged in filth. By the 1910s, there were more cars than horses in cities like New York, and the whole crisis faded into memory. This whole thing could be seen as a lesson for something like climate change. When the whole world faces an almost impossible challenge, an invention comes along that makes the previous panic almost seem idiotic. However, at the same time, there are at least a couple hundred years between the invention of the screw and the screwdriver, and the can came around decades before the can opener. So maybe we shouldn't hold our breath. And this brings me to today's question. Can you think of any other strange crises in world history? One that comes to mind for me is the gin craze of 18th century London. But do you know any others? Leave them in the comments below.